Hello and welcome to FTD Talk. My name is John James and I am a writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence and an advocate for men's mental health. In this episode I talk to Elizabeth Hobson, a gender equality activist, about feminism and its destructive nature. It's a fascinating conversation and I can't wait for you to hear it. But as always, before we go, please smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, so you can get all the latest videos from FTD Talk. You take care now. Peace. So, welcome Elizabeth to FTD Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. How are you doing? You alright?
Yeah, not too bad. Yourself?
Yeah, good talk. Can you start by just telling me a little bit about who Elizabeth Hobson is?
Oh, wow. With the easy ones. Well, I am a gender equality activist, an anti-feminist gender equality activist, which to some people might sound like a, what's the word? Gone word blank. A contradiction in terms, but actually having a fairly in-depth knowledge of what feminism is, it's entirely appropriate. I am a mother to two sons, I am a care worker, and I'm also a sort of libertarian with a small L, conservative, who was raised on the regressive left but rebelled, and someone who is passionate about freedom and liberty and human flourishing.
There's a lot to unpack there. That's great. And well, can you start by? Well, I'll start by saying that when I was going to do this interview, I thought it'd be easy. I thought feminism used to be all about equal rights, and then it sort of got taken over. Unpacking this was just unbelievable, mind blowing.
I had the same experience.
So, can you tell me? Start by explaining what feminism is supposed to be and when it started.
Ooh. Okay, so the dictionary definition of feminism is usually something about the advocacy of equal rights on behalf of the sexes. I would like to see that changed to the belief that women are disadvantaged as compared to men, that this is a societal problem and that it needs to be changed. And whilst what helps feminism to create a narrative of legitimacy is the fact that there were areas historically wherein women were disadvantaged as compared to men. There were also areas where men were disadvantaged as compared to women, but they don't mention that, and the mainstream narrative doesn't take that into account either, even beyond feminists. And so, there was a period where women couldn't vote. There were issues around property, which on the surface, in a feminist reading, include, the fact that when a woman married, her property became the property of her husband. That didn't come entirely without responsibilities, nor without the woman having some kind of power over how the husband disposed of her property. And he also became liable for any debts that she incurred. So it's really not as black and white as he became the sole guardian of her property. It's a lot grayer than that. But having said that, obviously it's not an progressive situation, shall we say, wherein a man is responsible for the family property. And there were bars and exclusions on women working in certain professions, on studying certain subjects, and all of these things feminists were part of movements to rectify. And that's where they get their legitimacy. However, you can see from the first wave, which was about dealing with all the things I've just mentioned. There were other issues still, even by the second wave, but the first wave, although they had legitimate causes to rail against, they were also highly misandric, and not just because they were completely blinkered to the fact that men had significant disadvantages as well. It's like in 2018 we saw the centenary of the Representation of the People Act, 1918, and it was billed as the act that gave women the vote, which it was. It was also the act that gave many men the vote. But as part of all of the celebrations, a book came out called Things a Bright Girl Can Do. And it was about a sort of middle-class girl who was very upset that she, what was expected of her was that she would get married and be a good wife rather than go to university and enter a profession. And I can empathise with that. But on the other hand, what her brother would have been expected to do is to go and risk his life in the trenches of World War One.
Yeah.
And it's like, on balance, I'm not convinced that she had the worst lot.
Yeah.
Equation. But if you look at the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls, which is seen as the first document in the first wave, although there's actually a French one that's a little bit earlier, what you find is essentially a list of grievances and complaints. Men do this to us, men do that to us, men are just awful, which are quite revolting. And there's a book by Christabel Pankhurst all about venereal disease, and the message in that, she goes on about prostitutes as white slaves, and she calls men little more than carriers of venereal disease. And this was the attitude that first wave feminists had towards men. And you've got to remember that, there were men who were very active in the cause of women's suffrage. So it was first floated in the House of Commons by Jeremy Bentham. And that was like, oh gosh, way before the Women's Social and Political Union was ever active. And John Stuart Mill campaigned on a platform including Votes for Women, and was voted in by his male electorate on that platform, and Henry Fawcett supported Millicent both intellectually and financially in her efforts. And so the wedge that was to be increasingly pushed between the sexes was absolutely visible even in the first wave. And actually, if you read feminist historians now, they actually identify a period of proto-feminism, which they've put as far back as the late Middle Ages, with the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And what she did was to subvert the chivalric code, which was like a series of codes all across Europe that were written and codified by lords and kings and bishops and all kinds of people, and they governed the relationships between knights and the authorities above them, but also the citizens. And so they were often about not mistreating people in general, working class people. But Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court subverted these chivalric codes into something more akin to what we think of as chivalry now, which created the sort of who is it? It's Arthur, not C.S. Lewis. Sorry, C.S. Lewis called this period the feudalization of love, because it essentially, by pushing the message that men were inherently base and bestial, and that women were morally superior, they created the idea that women should lead men to pursue higher goals, and also that they needed protection from men, which is essentially what feminism, I think that these feminist historians are absolutely right to point to this period as a root of the feminist movement, and they think that's a good thing. I don't, but yeah. So I put it back to the late Middle Ages, and I do think that there is an evolutionary psychology kind of foundation that it's built on, with women being the limiting factor in reproduction, and therefore human beings instinctively prioritizing our needs and wants. But I think that from the late Middle Ages onwards, increasing at a sort of exponential trajectory, there's really been this kind of unhealthy, like toxic kind of pushing of that natural instinct.
Yeah. Well, you certainly know your stuff. It's fascinating. Talking about the Pankhursts, some of the most famous feminists have been the Suffragettes. Now, like everybody else, I believed the history. I believed that they were fighting for equal rights. They were fighting for all women to get the vote. Researching for this, I find that's completely wrong. So, can you tell us a little bit about the Suffragettes as the true Suffragettes, which essentially were terrorists?
Absolutely. So the Women's Social and Political Union, or the Suffragettes, were founded by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel Pankhurst and Sylvia Pankhurst. And they were fighting for votes for women on the same terms as men, which meant with property qualifications and with education qualifications. So it was never about all women. It was absolutely about giving already very privileged women some more privileges. And they committed some really heinous acts, which were not overly well kind of understood as wrong at the time, because at the time working class people were not afforded the respect and imbued with or viewed with the humanity that they have or had as human beings. And so the suffragettes used to commit an awful lot of arson, and for example, and they made a lot of noise about the fact that, well, yes, we're burning down houses of men who oppose our cause, but they're empty. They're empty houses. We never do it when they're in.
Yeah.
But when a wealthy family was not at home, their servants would be upstairs in the sleeping quarters.
Yeah.
And they never, that didn't bother them. They set a bomb off inside of Lloyd George's house when that was being renovated. And he wasn't in, of course, because it was being renovated. And actually, it went off just before the builders got in, and only by chance. So there could have been workmen actually working when that went off, but there luckily weren't. But what was there were workmen's tools. And in this period, workmen provided their own tools. And if a workman's tools were damaged or lost or whatever, he then couldn't make a living. So what happened to the workmen that were working on that building is unknown. They might have ended up in the workhouse or on the streets, anywhere.
Yeah.
It took away their livelihood. There was a fantastic story about a cafe in Kew Gardens that they blew up, for God knows what reason. There was no specific connection. Nobody, the proprietor-ess had expressed no particular opinions on the cause either way. But after her cafe was destroyed, she went to the offices of the Women's Social and Political Union and explained that they had taken her livelihood and also the livelihoods of the women that she employed there. And she was told that, well, I'm sure that all of your staff will be pleased to have, added something to the cause. And the other interesting thing about the Women's Social and Political Union, and specifically their claim on being in some way responsible for women getting the vote, is that at the outbreak of World War I, 4 years before women were granted the vote, they ceased agitating for that cause and got behind the war effort by going round handing white feathers to men and boys who they thought should be fighting. And there are speeches by Emmeline which are just horrendous, with her railing against any man or man-looking boy who should have been out there protecting the women of the country. They're just so gynocentric, it beggars belief. But the one thing I will say is that Sylvia Pankhurst is a somewhat sympathetic character, because she was keen on the Irish kind of national movement, which got her kicked out of the WSPU by her mother and sister. But she also was a socialist, I think that's entirely forgivable at the time when the poor were genuinely so deprived. It's horrendous. There's a great book by what's his name? The book's called Jack London, People of the Abyss by Jack London, who was an American socialist who mainly wrote sort of adventure tales about men, frontiersmen and their dogs, but he came to East London to see how awful it was, and it's a great book. It's very tragic, and so I think that you would be fairly heartless not to be a socialist back then, without the benefit of hindsight and evidence proving it's a very bad idea. But she she set up a creche and a canteen in East London, where she employed women to feed local workers and also to look after children while their parents were out at work. So she is quite a sympathetic character to me. She also travelled to the United States and met their suffragettes and was just horrified by how racist they were. So she gets a pass, but the other two are horrendous. And I mean, Emmeline in particular, as you know, because I know you've read the Suffragette Fascists book, led the organisation like a little dictator.
Yeah.
So, which is highly ironic, because we see her as a champion of democracy, and it's not true in terms of her aims, and it's certainly not true in terms of her character.
Well, I was shocked that the suffragettes were the first people to detonate a bomb on British soil. That they were the inventors of the letter bomb.
Yeah.
And everything they do, many years later in the 1970s, the IRA did.
Yeah. And it's in terms of their methods were so sloppy, and so the letter bombs were just going off in postmen's arms. They weren't getting to their intended targets, but the suffragettes did not care. They didn't care for the postman.
They didn't care for the postman. They didn't care for all women, did they? They didn't care for working class women.
None.
Well, moving forward a little in time, one of the things that you hear about even now is the gender pay gap. Now, again, the books that I've read, and can you just tell us a little bit about that, because I've read that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, the feminists have actually, that has been so thoroughly debunked, that idea of the pay gap, that they have changed the terminology to the gender wage gap. And the gender wage gap does indeed exist. There are men as a block receive more in wages than women as a block. And that is for a variety of reasons. I have significant doubts that sexism is even anywhere on that scale in the list of reasons. There are, reasons like choice.
Yeah.
So women choose to work part-time, they choose to work fewer hours, they choose not to take the promotion because they would prefer to not have that responsibility, not have the responsibility to have to travel, to have to work overtime. Women choose to take career breaks more than men. I think, there may well also be a little bit of personality differences going on, in that women are more agreeable, and if feminists want women to earn more, I think maybe the message they should be putting out there is not, why even bother because the man next to you is just going to earn more, but actually saying, if you're capable and keen and worthy, then insist on a pay rise. You know,
Yeah.
tell your boss what you're worth. But that's unfortunately not the world we live in.
Do you think men are more likely to do that then? To say, I'm worth this?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do think that men rate higher in, they're more direct, they're more belligerent, and those are positive traits in many circumstances. And that is something that women would do well to learn from men. I think there are a lot of things that women could do well to learn from men, actually, despite the prevailing narrative. I remember it was an International Men's Day debate. I think could it have been 2019, but some MP from the Scottish National Party, who are an explicitly feminist party, as well as all their other problems, stood up and said, to paraphrase, that men commit suicide significantly more often than women.
Yeah.
And that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And men need to learn to be more like women and share their emotions, and then it'd all go away.
Yeah.
It was just, quite a hot take, I thought. And so yeah, I think the sexes have things to learn from each other, but I think that the sort of tenor of the conversation now is so polarized,
Yeah.
in that we have sort of completely opposing and equally unhealthy expectations and ideas of men and women, and really, and treatment as well of men and women. And there's no space for individual humanity and also individual responsibility when it comes to the messages that we give women. And so, yeah, yes, there's a gender wage gap, and yes, women are responsible. And I would also say that yes, a lot of women are perfectly happy with that,
Yeah.
because it's fulfilling to care for your family, and it's fulfilling to spend time attending to your interests, and maybe I actually think it would be quite nice if more men were afforded the opportunity to choose to do those things as well, because I do think that there is, while women have the option to go full steam into their career or to choose to do, to pull back on the career and attend to other parts of their lives, I think significantly less men have that option. I think there is an expectation from often the very women that they love, as well as, their family and friends kind of circles and the society, that their role is to provide.
Give me the option to retire and do other things, and I'd jump at it. The other thing that arises a lot is, look at the rape culture. And do you think that exists? Do you think there's a rape culture out there?
Certainly not. I think that it's a really damaging idea, the rape culture idea. In so many ways, you start with the kind of idea that there is a spectrum of rapey behaviours, and they go from rape to like off-colour jokes. That's not a spectrum. That's absolutely absurd to pathologise perfectly innocent behaviours not intended to hurt anyone, and who won't hurt anyone who's like a fully formed, strong and brave adult, stunning and brave adult. With that crime is really horrendous. But the concept of it also leads to injustices that are caused by the hysteria, and so all of the hysteria over the number of convictions for rape, which lead the police forces to pursue targets for convictions at the expense of pursuing actual justice, is utterly regressive. It's really so bad. But the rape culture myth also makes women fearful.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's useful either. I mean, the message that I would broadcast is that there certainly isn't a rape culture. We absolutely blatantly do not condone rape in our civilization. But there are reasonable steps that women and men can take to make themselves safer. But more than that, if a crime like that is visited upon you, it's not the sort of end of your life as feminists would have it. You know, actually, rape is on a spectrum with all the other traumas, in that most people emerge stronger after a trauma and smarter and excuse me, you know, generally kind of, you know, people, it's called post-traumatic growth. People rate themselves as vaguely and intangibly better after they've gone, you know, after they've survived cancer, after they've survived rape, after they've come through some kind of violent attack, or, you know, escaped from a burning building. And you know, that's what the research shows, and it's also what I think would be a much more useful message for a woman who has been through something like that. You know, it's like, yeah, it was awful, of course, and yeah, you're gonna have a period, more than likely, where you fall apart, but you'll build back stronger. And that's a reasonable expectation to have. And, you know, I mean, I think the other thing about the rape culture messaging is that if, you know, there is anything that we can say in this society to persuade women against going to the police and reporting rape, it's probably that our society as a whole, including the police, doesn't care, doesn't see you as fully human, thinks it's your fault. You know, that's the ideal way of putting people off reporting. But also, I mean, the other thing I think that does put women off reporting actual incidences is the lobbying that feminists have done, because they perceive this rape culture to have, you know, it's pushed police services and it's pushed the legislation into being hyper reactive when they receive an allegation.
Yeah.
And actually, this is something that Germaine Greer, of all people, has criticised.
Really?
So, you know, bearing in mind that rapists, as far as, you know, the feminist literature goes, and I, you know, yeah, no, it is true. I've seen the research as well. You know, rapists tend to be known to their victims. And when you know your rapist, you may well have fairly good reason to not want to see them jailed for 5-6 years. And so, you know, back in like the 70s, say, a woman could have gone to the police and said, look, my, you know, husband or whoever is mistreating me. Can you have a word?
Yeah.
And that could have happened. And, you know, in the sort of society that we have now in particular, there would have, you know, there would be no sympathy for a man mistreating his wife in that way. But the woman is disempowered. She can't ask that of the police, and the police are disempowered because they can't fulfill that request if asked. What they have to do is to push it for prosecution. They have to absolutely push it. And so, you know, I think that the rape culture myth creates injustice. I think it creates undue fear in women. And actually, I think it probably exacerbates the, thankfully fairly small, but I still think it exacerbates the incidence of rape.
Mm-hmm. Well, moving on to domestic violence. Can you explain to me what the Duluth Model is?
Sure. So the Duluth Model is a wheel, and at the centre it says power and control, and around the edge are all kinds of behaviours which range from, like rape and violence to saying something mean or financial control, which, could feasibly be unhealthy or part of an unhealthy pattern, but actually when the Duluth, or in the way the Duluth model is used, sort of quite minor incidents, and often incidents that really don't form a pattern, are used as evidence of domestic abuse. And the Duluth model is also based in patriarchy theory. So, if you read the models, they all refer to him doing, not, it's not gender neutral kind of thing. And the assumption is that men behave in these ways as part of a global male conspiracy to oppress women.
Wow. And all this that we've spoken about so far is promoting the woman as the victim and promoting men as the perpetrator in no matter what sphere of life it is. Why do you think that feminist narrative is so powerful?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'll have to take a minute on that one. So, I think that there's sort of, there's a few reasons that we've kind of got here. And one reason is that women's power is in our vulnerability, and on an evolutionary timescale, women's vulnerability has given us access to significant social protections.
Yeah.
But I also think if you look back to like the second wave, it's fairly well documented that second wave feminists saw the success that the civil rights movement in the US had in campaigning for equality for people of colour, and they literally transposed the tactics. And it's like it's so on the record that even John Lennon wrote the song "Woman is the Nigger of the World." Like, it was not a secret. It was literally talked about and documented that this is how Black America achieved equality. And, you know, the difference is that Black America was oppressed and they were victimized, whereas women weren't. But we have managed to capitalize on that idea fairly successfully. But, you know, I think there's an unfortunate kind of shadow, actually, that has been cast by the success of the civil rights movement, in that it's kind of inspired generations of identity politicians. And so it's kind of that legitimate cause has led to all kinds of copycats who don't have legitimate causes, but now see the power in claiming victimhood. And, you know, I think that, unfortunately, there is a tendency as well for humanity to swing on a pendulum between, you know, repression and liberty, and between kind of, you know, right and left, kind of socialism and capitalism. Like, we find it hard to find a middle ground, except in times of sort of great crisis, like, you know, wartime, when people are pushed together and have to work together and get intimately acquainted with people they never otherwise would have, and realize that actually these people are all right. But when we're in kind of times of affluence, we retreat back to our respective tribes. And it becomes very difficult to have frank and honest and open conversations. And, you know, I think that, you know, if you go back to, you know, the time of the Women's Social and Political Union, there were many areas in which British society, for example, was quite highly masculinized. And so, you know, if you look at the kind of health systems and the kind of just general prevailing atmosphere, it genuinely could have done with swinging a little bit to the middle and bringing in some positive aspects of femininity. But unfortunately, we sort of swung right past the middle, to the point where now I feel like we're living in a sort of horrendously hyper feminine society. And, you know, it's like there is no objective reality in society anymore. You know, it's people with no irony, with no trace of, like, you know, sarcasm, will tell you that, you know, their lived experience trumps the reality of evidence. And, whilst lived experience, I think, has a part to play in public conversation, to the way we, have absolutely kind of done away with the requirement for people to actually evidence their claims and actually back up what they're aiming for with some kind of objectivity, like, is very alarming, and it's not going to lead anywhere good.
Yeah, I see that with the Me Too movement, and you, as a man, you can't say anything, you can't do anything. You're fearful of saying anything to a woman. I mean, I know that I was at one point accused of sexual harassment for calling somebody sweetheart. So it's gone beyond a joke now. And do you think that the future of man is to be fearful, is to be confused of what to do, what to say?
I live in hope that it's not. I suppose I live in hope that this crescendo in the sort of feminization of our society is just getting so absurd that it won't be tolerated. And I do see little signs of that here and there. I do think that there is a movement that I hope is growing, that is no longer accepting the prevailing morality that is, striving for objectivity, that sees the kind of positive discrimination that we heap on women and says it's called discrimination.
Yeah.
Adding positive to it doesn't make it not discrimination. It's and I think that I don't know. I kind of veer between thinking it's all well too late and then feeling a bit hopeful. I think it's too late for many of our institutions. I think that we may well find that we have to start from scratch, with, in particular, like the education system.
Mm-hmm.
That is really not fit for purpose. And it's very damaging, I think. But maybe I'm wrong, because, it is that education system that I see pushing a lot of young men and women right away from feminism, because they're heaping it all on so thick.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's where the salvation lies? Do you think that's where men can even the playing field in is within education?
um I mean, I I mean, my personal hope is that neither of my boys choose a pathway that involves further education.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and it's like, I have friends who are, on pathways through education, higher education, like working there. And whilst they can see how wrong their own actions are
Yeah.
when they're involved in hiring processes wherein, and this is an actual anecdote that was told to me by a friend. He sat in a room with his colleagues and they separated the CVs that had come through into the not acceptable pile because they were men and the to consider pile because they were women.
Wow.
But, you know, he wasn't the only person in the room who knew it was wrong. His superiors knew it was wrong, but funding from central government is increasingly dependent on both having the equality and diversity statement
Mm-hmm.
available to anyone who wants to read it, but also proving that you have an active commitment to that. Because look, we've increased the number of women in senior positions by this much over this time. So is it possible to salvage that situation from the inside, from inside education? I don't see how.
Okay.
Mm.
And then where do you see the salvation then? Do you see men being able to level the playing field?
Yeah, I think that one of two things happen when people are discriminated against in the way that men are in our society and, spoken about with such scorn. They either fall apart and suffer and can't can't get can't but they have a failure of self-belief.
Yeah.
They're told that all the problems in the world are due to them and everything they do is wrong, and if they believe that, then what can they possibly do
Mm-hmm.
apart from some kind of, annihilate themselves in some way for the
Which they
greater
are
good?
doing with suicide.
Yeah, but there is another response, which is like the Churchillian response, because Churchill was told by his schoolmasters that he was useless and would never amount to anything.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought, well, I'll show them. And so I hope that there are enough men who take that attitude, um, and when they do, there are still opportunities for men to really succeed in our society, personally and professionally. Um, and I hope that the sort of anti-woke movement in general can inspire men to realise that the narratives that are being thrown at them from the time they're born, from every direction, are just rubbish.
Yeah.
And that they are worth something, and that it is worth valuing themselves.
Yeah.
Mm.
I 100% agree with you. I think men have got to stand their ground, no matter what is thrown at them, and just say, I'm not gonna take it.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, and I think that's the way we can blow feminism out of the water. Like you say, there are some good things about it, and we can take them on, but we've got to sift through it.
Yeah.
In discard the rubbish, and I think that's down to us. I think you're right. So before we go, what does the future hold for Elizabeth Hobson?
Well, I have been working a little bit around my day job on the International Conference for Men's Issues, which is coming up next month. I was just remembering what month it is now, although actually it might be this month by the time this comes out. And I'm hoping, I've got this stack of books right next to me. I'm hoping are going to help me write my own speech, which is on women's violence and society's responses to women's violence.
Mm-hmm.
And what else? Well, actually, I mean, what else is like, I honestly don't know, because I mentioned earlier that I'm a care worker, and as of April the 1st, I will no longer be a care worker because I refuse to take the vaccine. So I'm looking for a job. If anyone's got one, comment.
She's a great girl. Come on, somebody out there's got to have a job for her. Do you find, the last final question, do you find that being an anti-feminist and a gender equality activist, do you find you get backlash?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do.
In what form? Because I say this because I saw a video of you doing a speech, and there were people making a noise, banging drums or whatever outside.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I get, trolled and criticized on social media, which is particularly fun sometimes. Like, most of it is water off a duck's back, but every so often I wake up, like, we're talking like once a year, I'll wake up and go, I really feel like having a fight online, and we'll sift through some comments to find someone who really doesn't like me and start engaging in a conversation with them. And I have long and tense conversations with my mother. She doesn't get where I'm coming from at all. But I mean, apart from my mother and very ideologically possessed people online, on a day-to-day basis, I'm actually surprised with the lack of backlash that I get. Mm-hmm. Because, well, I used to, when my mind first started changing, because I was originally, pro-feminist, and then I actually called myself a feminist, and then I learned how awful it was, and changed my mind. And when I changed my mind, I was frightened to tell people. And then bit by bit, I started drip feeding it to kind of normies.
Yeah.
And most people are kind of surprised but not horrified.
Yeah.
And so I think I get backlash from all the right people.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. That's been a fascinating conversation. I need to dig into it a lot more because I've enjoyed the books that I've seen you throw up on social media, and I've enjoyed them. So thank you very much for today, and bless you. Carry on the good work.
Lovely to talk to you.
You too. Take care now.
Speak soon.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.